Very special thanks once again to Philip Raby Specialist Cars. Of course, I've worked with them a couple of times now on the channel with the Mercedes E55 AMG review, and more pertinently to this video, the 993 generation Carrera as well. They're always a pleasure to work with, so if you want to check out their current stock that's for sale, and also their Porsche servicing if you are an existing owner, just click the link below this video in the description, and you can check out all of those services. One of the first things that actually piqued my interest about this particular generation of 911, a Phase 2 997 shape, or 997.2 as it's often called, is funnily enough how many similarities there are between this and the 993 Carrera, which I reviewed on the channel from the 90s. Now, of course, they're both 911s, so you'd expect them to have a lot in common. That's kind of an ongoing joke in the petrolhead world, but I mean really tangible ways. For instance, the interior. The dashboard really stuck out to me as being a clear homage from this car to the 993 back in the 90s. And funnily enough, it's more of an homage to that car than it is even to the 996, which came after that one. That has a much more traditional curvy interior. This is unabashedly retro in some interior ways, and I think it looks really good for it. When you combine that with the fact that it has the updated, almost current even style of steering wheel and shifter, which also came in on the Panamera at a similar time, which I love the look of, it kind of has this meeting of modern style and retro style together. And all that is to say that the interior is a very nice place to be. Now, of course, it is a 2+2. The rear seats don't have as much legroom because it is a sports car at the end of the day, but it is nice to know that you have them if you want to use them. In terms of trunk space, of course, it's under the front instead of the back, being rear engine, rear wheel drive. This is a PDK gearbox model, which does add 30 kilos to the weight, but interestingly does make the car quicker, because even with the extra 30 kilos, it still only weighs 1,450, so it's far from being the heaviest sports car out there, not even close in fact, and the engine in this particular Carrera, which is the Carrera S, has about 40 to 45 horsepower more than the base model Carrera. That's about a 340 horsepower engine. This is 380, 385, 310 pound-feet of torque as well, which is pretty thumpy, especially given that this, of course, is naturally aspirated, which is a very nice set of words to say for any petrol head. Of course, no turbos, no superchargers, just the pure engine. And even though I do love turbo and supercharger aspirated cars, there is something just more romantic, especially for a sports car, when it comes to a naturally aspirated engine. And when it comes to this car, as I'm going to elaborate on in a second, to be honest, it doesn't even feel like it needs a turbo, because this is a very, very fast car. Now, on paper, it sounds really quick, but this is one of those occasions where the car definitely goes beyond the raw numbers. You could take two vehicles that do 0 to 60 in technically the same time, but one of them feels very underwhelming even, and the other will feel extremely visceral, because of course it's more than about just numbers. It's about the noise it makes, how the suspension sways and bucks, how the car feels under that performance as well. And that is one of my favourite things, if not probably my favourite thing actually, about this 911. This, to me, as I'll be completely honest, not a huge 911 fan. I don't dislike them by any stretch, but it's never been one of my absolute favourite cars. Again, it's kind of like the Nissan GTR for me. I have huge amounts of respect for it, but it's not my top 10 vehicle kind of thing. But I will say that after driving this one and the 993, they definitely deserve their reputation. And this one in particular of those two really, really impressed me. In fact, I would go so far as to say this is easily one of the most impressive and most fun cornering machines I've reviewed so far. Now, the performance, as I said, is face-rippingly quick. 385 horsepower is good, but it doesn't sound crazy, especially not for a sports car or a super sports car. I mean, something like an Audi R8 from that kind of time had, what, 414 horsepower? Something from America like a Corvette or a Viper is going to have a lot more. So surely 385 is going to be a little bit underpowered compared to those, especially when it doesn't have torque, really, to back that up either. 310 pound-feet is good, but It's not earth-shattering. Well, spoiler alert, it's real fast, because 0 to 60 is quoted at 4.5 seconds. It's Porsche though, which means it's definitely quicker than that. They always undersell their cars, which is a great way to be. And the top speed on this one, the Carrera S in particular, is 188 miles an hour. Now that, from a 385 horsepower naturally aspirated engine, is pretty incredible. It's like TVR kind of performance, but with the German build quality and the reliability and the usability on top as well. Now, speaking to that usability, one of the things that I always have to talk about, for apparent reasons when you look at me on the video, I always appreciate the practicality and the space in particular of any given car. So if a sports car, or any vehicle for that matter, is cramped, especially for headroom, sometimes for legroom or width room, or even just a lack of seat adjustment in general, I'm going to notice it pretty fast. In fact, I've had 1 or 2 occasions in the past where I actually could not review a car when I got there because I couldn't fit in it and drive it properly. This definitely wasn't one of those occasions. It was very impressive. In fact, it had some of the most impressive space, for headroom in particular, which really surprised me, of any sports car I've driven so far. It was really comfortable, really spacious, more than spacious enough in fact, for what is, and this is what you've got to bear in mind, a relatively modest car in terms of proportions. The 911 is not a wide car, and especially by today's standards, that's a big deal. That really is bucking the trend. Now, the newer 911s, especially the current ones, are much bigger, especially in terms of width, and for purists, that's one of the gripes that they can sometimes have, and I can understand why. See, as I said in my review of the 993, and also with this one, that narrower width, but still being spacious on the inside, means that you can genuinely use this thing on any British road. Even on tight back lanes, it still feels planted, and it doesn't feel like you have to breathe in every time you drive past a car. That's a fantastic advantage to have. It's a uniquely UK advantage, of course. In the States you would never even think about that, but in the UK it's a huge deal. Now, in terms of practicality, fuel economy is way better than you'd think. Around town it does drop to about 18, but even so, that is not bad at all for a car that can do 188 miles an hour. On the motorway, it can get up around 40 to the gallon, which is incredibly good, and overall you're going to be averaging about 27, 28, as you could even see on the dashboard of the car here. That tends to be what I was hovering around, so that is accurate to real life. But again, 28 to the gallon from a nearly 190 mile an hour car is very impressive indeed. Now, so far we've got good fuel economy, good room, a very well appointed, comfortable, high quality interior, 2+2 seating, even a decent amount of front trunk space, and it's not overly big for UK roads. Are we even still talking about a sports car at this point? Well, of course, let's get back to that side of things. Because the two things that I really loved the most about driving this car, in fact, in both ways more so than the 993, which was already great at both of these things, but this is worlds apart, are both the acceleration, in particular the way in which it delivers its acceleration, and secondarily to that, the way it takes corners. Now, I've discussed on the channel before that handling, steering, personality, and driving manners, these are all terms that are generally interchangeable, but really they are very different things. A car's handling and a car's steering are totally different things. You can have a car that can technically steer very well, but isn't necessarily fun. This has both. Because of the rear engine rear-wheel drive layout, the front end is so precise, not light, precise. Huge difference. An older 911 certainly could feel a bit lighter over the front end, maybe a little bit leery. The 993 wasn't, but when you go old school 911, you could have some of that in there, and not just them as well. Any mid-engine or rear-wheel drive sports car could lean that way. This one doesn't. There's enough weight over the front to still make it feel planted, almost even all-wheel drive sometimes in terms of the level of grip, while at the same time giving you some of the sharpest steering and handling that I've ever experienced. The driver feedback is fantastic. You know exactly what the car's going to do, you know exactly what the car wants to do, and that is a crucial point for me, because when it comes to personality, this car has more than the 993. To me, the 993 feels like a very academically proficient sports car. It's a tank in terms of how well built it is. It's technically quick, it looks great, it's a fantastic collector's piece, and it is genuinely usable, all of which I said in my review. This one though, to me at least, has even more passion, and for a sports car, 911 or otherwise, that's kind of a big deal. I loved the attitude and the personality and the playfulness, actually, which is not usually a German word when it comes to any car, that this has. The car feels like it's constantly telling you, come on, I can do this, push it harder, go faster, but not in a kind of ballistic way. The car doesn't feel like it's trying to kill you or push you over the edge. It feels like it's encouraging you, almost like you're walking with the car. And I know that is another thing which a lot of people have said about this generation, wherein it's kind of the last pure driver's 911. And based on my experience with this one, I could definitely feel that being the case. The secondary thing though, and this is probably my favourite thing about the car to be honest, is the acceleration. Now, it's going to be quicker than 4.5 because Porsches always are. But it's not so much what it can technically do, because I've driven plenty of cars that can do that kind of 0 to 60 time, even a big super saloon like a Jaguar XFR, but the thing is, it's the way it feels when it's accelerating. See, that PDK gearbox, even without using flappy paddles, actually adaptively learns how you like to drive. And even in the time that I had the car, it began to learn what I like to do. It learned 2 distinct personality types, which is basically the way that I tend to drive. You've got the one side of me which is very sensible, pottering around, getting the better fuel economy and just getting a feel for a vehicle, whether I'm entering it for the first time or driving my own car on a daily basis, that kind of driving. And then when you switch, see an open road or a few corners and want to have some fun, you tend to go into a different mental space. The car knows that, and it responds instantly, and of course the longer you spend with it, the better it gets. So by the time I actually finished driving this car, it felt fantastic, and it felt great to begin with. And one of the most notable ways that that applied was that acceleration. So when you're driving around, usually it gets up through the gears very quickly. It's got a 7-speed auto, technically, in normal conditions. And because of efficiency, you get through most of those gears even at lower speeds. Up around 60, 70 miles an hour, you'll be in 7th gear, preserving fuel economy, etc., because that's all you need to be doing. But then if you go from a standing start or just lower speeds out of a corner, and then just open it up that little bit more, not even foot to the floor, I actually found the most surprising part when I was about maybe 50 to 60% throttle, wherein the car immediately knows what you want from it. And the acceleration builds almost in this 2-step way, which funnily enough reminded me in a very tangential sense of my experience in the Supra from the 90s with that sequential turbo. The results of that sequential turbo were that you didn't have the traditional lag, and it felt like the acceleration just built relentlessly. In this car it does as well, but without the turbos. It feels like it gets going up to about 40 miles an hour, maybe 45, but then something happens and the car's personality just switches. The sound gets louder and it opens up. It almost felt like a turbine. And you guys know how much I love that. In fact, it's my favourite engine type. So to have this kind of acceleration where it builds for a little bit, like a second or two at the most, and then suddenly completely opens up and goes 50, 60, 70, 80 miles an hour in no time at all, well, for one thing, it makes you really doubt that 0 to 60 time of 4.5 seconds because it feels a whole lot quicker than that, but it also makes it that much more fun to do it. Because yes, on the one hand, from a barstool talk point of view, it's very cool to brag that you have a 188 mile an hour car, regardless of what it is, but the reality is you barely ever use that. On special occasions, maybe in Germany, especially in Britain, you ain't going to be doing 188 that often, if at all. Much like a track day, most owners won't do it that often, if at all. Acceleration, on the other hand, well, that's why I love it so much. That's why I love my Touareg. That's why I love a number of vehicles that just have this brutal low-end shove, because it doesn't even matter about the top speed. That is the case here. You have so much fun up to like 70 or 80 miles an hour that the rest is almost irrelevant. And in particular, the most fun is between about 40 miles an hour and 80, which is perfect for the UK, especially when you add that into the mix of a nice twisty B road. A roads, B roads, it eats them up, and it's so much fun to do so. In fact, it's a sports car which I believe anyone who doesn't like autos should try, because in a similar way to actually being in an electric car, something like a Tesla for instance for the first time will change your mind about electric vehicles, or in my case riding an electric motorcycle sealed what I already loved about them, but it's a great way of kind of turning people around on that negative opinion which they could have. To me, a car like this is a perfect machine for somebody who doesn't like automatics to actually experience, because it's such a clever use of an auto that it doesn't even feel like one. It goes from, on the one hand, as I said, shifting up and down through 7 speeds for the sake of efficiency and being pleasant, to then just keeping it in 4th and going rabid like an animal. And I loved it under both circumstances. In fact, the only thing which I wasn't a fan of when it came to this car, and this is something which you might be able to change to some degree, but in effect it's one of the reasons why it's actually good, and I'll explain why, is the suspension. As you can kind of tell from some of the occasions and camera angles and bumps and turns in the video, it's a little bumpy. It's fairly stiff when it comes to the springs and dampers, but it's a sports car, which is why I just said that's kind of the point. That's one of the reasons why it's so good through corners. Of course it doesn't feel as soft as an E55 or a Touareg V10 or a Jag XK, because it's not supposed to be. It's lighter, it's more focused, it is a purer sports car, even though you could call it a 2+2 GT, but we all know it's a sports car really. That to me is the only thing which, for my preference of driving, would put me off a little bit using one every day, because it wants to, go and play all the time and it has that kind of harsher suspension. But at the same time, if you can just put up with that, and when I say put up with that, it's not as harsh as it sounds. It's not like you're driving a stripped out cage race car all over the place. It's just something to bear in mind. If you test drive one for yourself, you'll understand what I mean. It's not uncomfortable per se, it's just noticeable compared to a more traditional car. The payoff though, I would say, is definitely worth it though, because it's so good through corners, the acceleration is incredibly addictive, the sound is very nice as well, and the fact that you don't have the kind of lag that, for instance, a turbo would have, an older turbo let's say, and it's not quite as hardcore and wants to just go and break a lap record somewhere all the time like a GT3 or a GT2 would, well, that's why the Carrera is, generally speaking, the daily driver 911. I already had those thoughts when it came to the 993, and now they're definitely cemented when it comes to this one. This is my preferred of the two so far, even though prior to driving them both I was more of a 993 fan based on the looks of it. Overall though, I loved driving this car, and even though I'm still not what I would say a 911 super fan, that kind of says even more about the car. If somebody who's not an existing super fan of the 911 still absolutely loved it, that pretty much tells you everything you need to know. Overall though, that's it for this review. Of course, check out my other 911, stick around for more reviews on the channel, and be sure to hit the notification bell to see my new vids when they're released. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.